So we'll go ahead and get started so we can keep things running on time. If you do need to get up, feel free. This is going to be as informal of a session as it can be with me propped up here on the stage. Really my goal here is to give you a very introductory look at ASP.NET MVC. It's definitely a 101 course. We're going to have some demos. We're going to have some good demos. We've got some slides to go through with some good information. I'll make the same disclaimer I made at my first presentation this morning. I do tend to move quickly, and especially if you can't keep up with my English, because I do move rather quickly in that sense. But all of my code, all of my slides, everything will be available afterwards. They're recording all these presentations, so you can watch the videos later if you do miss anything, and I'll be available afterwards for any questions. With that said, let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. So first look, ASP.NET MVC. Let's introduce ourselves. My name is Todd Anglin. I work for Telerik. I'm the Chief Technical Evangelist there. It's a big title, which means essentially I get to travel around talking to developers like you, teaching you about new technologies, showing you how they work, and at the same time taking feedback from you and helping Telerik build the products you need to basically make your applications work. I'll stay out of the light of the projector. I'm also an active ASP.NET community member, president of the North Houston.NET user group. You can find me on the web in several places. I have a couple of blogs. TelerikWatch.com is the one I update most often, so feel free to visit there, and that's where you'll be able to find the slides from today's event. And also weblogs.asp.net, the official ASP.NET weblogs / Todd Anglin. You can find me there too. And then I've got some Silverlight resources that are also of note. Maybe not so much for this session, but I'll put them out there as well. There's some stuff on O'Reilly you can find. Who do I work for? I work for a company called Telerik. As I alluded to, we make .NET developer tools and UI components for ASP.NET and WinForms right now, WPF and Silverlight as the year goes on. And then we also have a Telerik reporting product, a Sitefinity CMS, a full ASP.NET-based CMS system. We've won a lot of awards for the work we've done. We've tried to build tools that are very lightweight, that implement all the standards the way they should be implemented, and at the same time delivering you the power you need to build rich UIs in your applications and or in the developer tool space, build your applications more quickly and more efficiently. How many people in here have heard of Telerik or used Telerik's tools, just for reference? Okay, a few of you. So for everybody else, here's your introduction. We're pioneering the AJAX space, which means we've been doing AJAX things, cutting-edge web things now for quite a while. Before it was titled AJAX, load on demand is what it was previously for us. So when it comes to talking about new technologies, like we're talking about today, ASP.NET MVC, you can rest assured that Telerik continues to look forward and continues to look at technologies like this so that we can deliver to you the tools you need to really take the most advantage out of those tools in your applications. But before we can really dig into ASP.NET MVC and understand why it's relevant and why we need it to build today's applications, we really need to understand what came before ASP.NET MVC. Why does the ASP community think it needs a new MVC framework? And to do that, we're going to take a little walk down memory lane back to the early days of ASP and try to sort of figure out how we got to where we are today. So the very root of this all is active server pages, which were introduced around 1996 as a beta, so they've been out there in the public for quite a while. And they were originally part of an upgrade to Internet Information Server 2. So it was originally a way to deliver dynamic content if you were using IIS. Has anybody developed with active server pages pre-.NET era? Okay, about half the room. So you kind of understand then where the roots of this was. I started with web development on active server pages, and it was sort of a real spaghetti of code. You know, things were all mixed together. The UI markup and the code markup was all strung together. We used VB scripts largely to coordinate our actions. So really rough beginning, but nonetheless, there we can find the roots of the active, the dynamic pages that we've built with Microsoft Stack. The goal was, obviously, to make it, to enable the web to become more than static HTML. So up to this point, in around 1996, you can kind of think back to what was on the web at that point. Applications were relatively static. They're largely made up of HTML, some images. Maybe you could find cascading style sheets. It really wasn't common at this time. Very poor browser support in that arena. Nonetheless, we were moving towards more dynamic applications, and ASP was Microsoft's way of doing that with VBScript. We've had 3 versions of ASP, so we went through ASP 1, and then we had 2, and then 3 whatever before we hit the .NET era. And then we had the major upgrade to .NET. So .NET sort of changed the game for ASP. ASP.NET, while related in name, is not related at all in fundamental technology. Some of the syntactical things got brought forward, but now everything was running on .NET. So now we had a compiled experience. We had managed code. We were sort of done with the days of the just spaghetti, ASP Classic, VB script-based coding, and that was around the year 2000. And you may remember it was originally called ASP Plus, and then the old ASP became ASP Classic. Well, now we all know it as ASP.NET, and that sort of stuck. What we work with now with ASP.NET, we're actually, again, in the third version of ASP.NET. So just as we had 3 versions of ASP in the old ASP Classic days, we've sort of reached that point again now with our ASP.NET generation of technology. So very recently, as of even this year, we're now on ASP.NET 3.5, and now the 0.5 numbering has gotten a little awkward, but nonetheless, you can think of this as ASP.NET 3, essentially, the third major release. 3.5.NET shipped in January. I think you could really think of 3.5 as really being complete later this summer when they release the 3.5 features into the main framework, because that's really where the core of the updates to the version 3 of ASP.NET exist. We're not going to go into it in depth today, but I'll encourage you guys to take a look at that in your own time. And what was the goal of ASP.NET? What were we trying to do in that generational leap from ASP to ASP.NET? And really, it was to improve our ability to manage state. If anybody programmed in the ASP Classic days, you recall anytime a form posted back or sent information, you had to write a lot of code to repopulate those values into your form fields. Let's say if an error occurred and they need to re-see the page. You do a lot of request.forms, request.service, fill in the values when the page reloaded, check to see if it was post back or not with your own little mechanism. And ASP.NET sought to automate that for us so we as developers could spend less time worrying about the plumbing and more time worrying about the actual application code. And to do that, they introduced a lovely little technique called ViewState. How many of you have heard of ViewState? How many of you are web developers? If you're a web developer and you haven't heard of ViewState, you're in trouble, because that means your page is probably in terrible condition. ViewState is a love-hate relationship for ASP.NET developers. It makes our lives very simple because now the framework automatically handles all that state management for us. Whenever we want to post back a page, we don't have to worry about filling the values back into the forms, or we don't have to worry about checking this, writing our own mechanism to make sure code only executes on postbacks. The framework gives us tools to do that. And that was a big leap forward for web developers in ASP.NET. Later versions, such as the ASP.NET 2.0 enhancements, we got control state, which was sort of like a view state, but more put in smaller segments, so that you could manage the state for specific controls and still turn off view state broader for the application. So we've had a number of improvements since the original days of ASP.NET, but nonetheless, the fundamentals are the same. And what else has improved for ASP.NET? We got the Visual Studio Ide, and that was a big deal because originally Visual Studio was not designed for web development. In fact, the early days of Visual Studio's ASP.NET support were pretty rough. It wasn't a great place to develop for the web. It still felt very clunky. But now, in the versions we're dealing with today, 2005 and 2008, hopefully for increasingly more of you, and even the Express editions, Visual Web Developer, or Visual Studio Express Web Development version, whatever it's titled, have made it a lot easier to develop for the web within Visual Studio. And even beyond that, it's made it easy to develop for the web regardless of what you develop, giving us lots of shortcuts with IntelliSense, great compile time, checking for errors, and then even an integrated way to see our layout before we put it on the browser. Maybe not the best way to see our layout, but certainly a way to sort of check our work as we go. And code behind files. So code behind files enabled us to take all that spaghetti code we were doing in ASP Classic, where we're mixing in our VB script with our markup, and pull it out and separate it. So we saw at the very beginnings in ASP.NET of the concept of separation of concerns, which means basically keep each individual part separate from the other part, so we don't have this spaghetti mix mash of unrelated things. And code behind enabled us to take our code out and make that separation very clean, in theory. Now, it wasn't the perfect way to do that. We still found as developers we could sort of break the rules and mix code in. We weren't really honoring what the intent was very well, but nonetheless, it was a movement in that direction. So, as we look at our history, we've seen ASP Classic, we moved to ASP.NET. What do we need going forward? What's wrong with what we have today? And when I look at that and I try to think about, okay, why do we need to move past where we are today? You come up with the concept of the good, the bad, and the ugly of ASP.NET. And let's look at what we're dealing with our current set of technologies with ASP.NET that sort of fit into these different categories. First of all, the good. It's always good to start with the good. ASP.NET is great for state management. I mean, there's not really much of an easier way you can do state management as a web developer than what ASP.NET provides. If application performance and scalability aren't huge things to you, which in all honesty, they don't have to be if you're building a very small application for an internal set of clients, maybe it's 5 or 6 users, 10 users, whatever the case may be, it's a very quick way to build a working web application that you don't have to do a lot of extra work to stand up. Very good at that. A very familiar programming model. Since ASP.NET is built on .NET, that means we can use C#, VB.NET, whatever CLR language we're comfortable with to write the dynamic code that powers our website. We don't have to go learn new code. We've got code we're used to. We can compile it. We can use the IDEs we're familiar with. All this is an advantage of working with ASP.NET in its current state. And like I said, with the ability to build this stuff quickly with this built-in support for view state, with this built-in support for things that we don't have to do ourselves, makes the ability to develop a site very quickly a reality. We don't have to spend days building a site. We can build a pretty good site probably in one day, maybe even a week for a big site. And that's not going to be just standard cookie cutter. With using web server controls and other things on the page, we can build a pretty robust site with logins and membership in a very short time. This is a huge advantage of working with the current ASP.NET framework. And of course, there's a robust third-party market. So if you get stuck and something that you need to do is not built into the framework, there are a lot of options out there where you can go buy, or even the open source community download, something that's going to solve your problem where you don't have to do the work yourself. Because unless you're in the business of making the solution to the problem you have, you're wasting your time if you've built it yourself. In other words, if you're not in the business of making wheels, don't make wheels. Go buy wheels from somebody who are experts at making wheels, and save yourself the time and focus on what you're building, which in this case is the car. You want to focus on the big picture and let the small things handle themselves, and that's what the rich third-party market and open source community is doing for ASP.NET today. But there is some stuff that's not so great, and this is what we're going to start with, and we're going to call the bad. There's a pretty weak separation of concerns. And again, separation of concerns is where we want to basically keep the UI markup and the code, the business logic that powers our site, and the data access logic completely separate. So there's no intermingling of those things, so that we can have them cleanly tested, cleanly isolated, and not end up with spaghetti code like we've had to support for years. And while ASP.NET introduced the code behind files, and that sort of moved us in that direction of not keeping our UI code and our business logic at the same place, it really didn't go far enough, because it's still very, very easy to put our data access code within our code behind files, to use our code behind files inappropriately for maintaining our databases, for just rewriting code without doing, or I should say, how should I phrase this, to use code inefficiently, basically to write code over and over again without putting it into separate classes as it should be. Essentially, it was a step, but it wasn't a step far enough. We can still go further with supporting this concept of separation of concerns within the framework. Now, can you do separation of concerns cleanly with ASP.NET? Absolutely. There are plenty of good tools and frameworks and guidance packages out there that enable you to do it, but it's not really the built-in guidance within the framework. And that sort of moves us to our next point, is that it doesn't really encourage best practices for web development. So if you just picked up the framework and started using it, there's nothing within the framework that's going to sort of push you in the direction of doing web development the right way. It's going to enable you to do web development fast, but it's going to leave you burdened with view state and control IDs that are sort of mucked around with different naming. It may not do AJAX as efficiently as it should. In other words, it's making you fast, but it's not making you great. There's support for this from the Patterns and Practices group at Microsoft that try to give you prescribed guidance, how to do things in a best practice kind of way. But you have to seek that out on your own. You have to learn that. You have to integrate it with your solution. So again, it's not really baked into the framework where it should be, so that anybody who picks up ASP.NET is working in a best practice manner. And we can very easily, with this in mind, end up with bloated page size. So if we're not careful, and if we're not managing our view state, for instance, and I come back to that because it's one of the most common mistakes we make as web developers with ASP.NET, then we can very quickly have a very bloated page size. So where we can't even see it unless we're doing very good analysis of applications, we can hide an extra 100, 200 kilobytes, if we're bad, of data just hidden view state or in hidden fields, which is something that a lot of developers with ASP.NET do, and the framework doesn't make it really easy to avoid that. So if we think about what this separation of concerns looks like, and we'll use a plate of spaghetti, since we always talk about spaghetti code to sort of illustrate it, then we'd start with a plate that looks like this. In our ASP Classic days, we had our noodles and our sauce just all mixed together. So whenever we looked at our application, there was no separation of where the code ended and where the markup started. It was all pieced together, all mixed together, no separation at all. As we moved to ASP.NET, then we ended up where there's some separation. So we've got the noodles cleanly on the bottom, and we've got the sauce cleanly on top. But they're still very tightly connected. They're not really decoupled at all. The code behind and the markup live pretty much in the same space. And as we move forward, ASP.NET MVC, we get into the very clean separation of concerns, where our sauce is in one cup over here, and our noodles are in a cup over here. There's no tight intermingling of them, so you have this very easy approach to writing code in a good way. And that's one of the concepts we're going to reinforce as we go into MVC here, is that it enables you to do best practice development from the get-go, baked into the framework's guidelines. But before we can talk about MVC, we've got to understand the ugly of ASP.NET, because certainly there's the bad and there's the good, but the ugly is what we really hate. And that, at the very top of the list, would be it's very hard to unit test ASP.NET applications. How many people in here have tried to unit test an ASP.NET app? So like 5 people have tried out of a room of 200. That should be some testament, because I already learned that about half of you are web developers. So that tells me that over half of you are building ASP.NET applications that you aren't unit testing. And I don't blame you, because it's actually much harder than it should be. And this is a problem with the framework and the way the framework was built without using a lot of interfaces, that we just have a hard time as developers building unit tests that can be run quickly, which unit tests need to be. And that's something that ASP.NET MVC primarily tries to fix. And we'll look at how. Untamed view state, I can't hammer that home enough. It's a big problem with ASP.NET, and we just have to deal with that. It's difficult to use with JavaScript, because if you've ever written JavaScript for ASP.NET, well, let's just poll the audience. Have you ever been frustrated trying to write JavaScript that works with ASP.NET pages? Okay, there's like 10 of you, which the rest of you, I assume, just don't write JavaScript, because if you've ever written JavaScript with ASP.NET, you'd be frustrated. Largely because ASP.NET will use its own framework tools at liberty to change the IDs of the controls on the page, largely to fit into this control hierarchy that it builds. When it does that, it can break your JavaScript, because now you can no longer reference the clean IDs. So we need to fix that. We need to make it easier for ASP.NET developers to write JavaScript, which means we need cleaner output, cleaner HTML output. And finally, ASP.NET can have a pretty big impact on your search engine optimization. Anybody know why? Somebody knows why? Okay, none of you know why. Well, that means, okay, that's why search engine optimization is important, but why does ASP.NET make it, what negative impact does ASP.NET have on your SEO? Yep. So the basic concept here, and you're touching on it there, is that ASP.NET adds a lot of weight to your page that basically it inhibits the ability of a crawler to really see the important data on your page. So, for instance, view state, again, or event ID, all this information that's in the hidden fields at the top of your page, when a crawler comes to your page that's been built with ASP.NET, it runs into that first. And a lot of crawlers will only read so many bytes into your page before they decide your page isn't important because it can't find useful information. So if you constructed a bad page that has tons of view state at the top, the crawler may not ever get to the important information in your page that would make it indexable in the search engines. And ASP.NET's not helping you with this at all, because it's putting all this junk in the top of your page. And so unless you're very aware of this and you're doing things to sort of counteract this, then you can end up with a page that isn't friendly to search engine crawlers, which if you're in the business of making public sites or even intranet sites that need to be indexed well by internal search engines, then you can have a very difficult site to use with the search engine. So we need to improve that too. We need a technology for ASP.NET developers that makes our SEO better. ASP.NET MVC. Here's part of the solution. Now, one thing we want to talk about with ASP.NET MVC is that it's an option. It's not a replacement for ASP.NET. And that's the point that Microsoft makes over and over again anytime they talk about ASP.NET MVC. And I'll stress it a few times here today, that it's not a replacement for ASP.NET web forms. I'll get it right one of these days. It's not a replacement for that. It's an alternative for people that want to fix the problems we've talked about. So, It was introduced in October of 2007, which really isn't that long ago, less than a year ago. So as you can guess, that means it's got a ways to go before it's going to be a finalized framework that you can actually get your hands on and use in safely use in production environments. You can get your hands on the code right away. Currently we're in a preview 2. As with a lot of new projects coming out of Microsoft, they're not following really prescribed beta, CTP sort of release programs. MVC has adopted this sort of Codeplex, release it as it's ready model of putting code in your hands. So every 2 weeks or so, I'm not exactly sure how good they're doing at sticking to this, but very regularly you can find updates to the ASP.NET MVC framework on Codeplex, and you can download the latest bits, play with them, keep up with it. Now, this is good in the sense that it gets code in your hands early, but this also creates a number of problems, most notably of which is that every time a new release ships, it makes all the information that's on the web about that release outdated. So if you go start Googling ASP.NET MVC, looking for help, you may find quite a few articles, blogs, whatever you may find are already written to an outdated version of the framework. In other words, they no longer are relevant to the current bits that are out there. So be very careful when you start researching a technology like ASP.NET MVC that you're looking at articles and blogs that are relevant to the most recent release, which is a little difficult to do. But Preview 2 is what we're on now. It's an alternative to ASP.NET. It's not a replacement. So if you're using web forms now, if you don't like ASP.MVC, you don't have to use it. It still uses .NET on the server, so that much isn't changing. So you can still use all the coding that you're familiar with. You can use the membership tools that come with ASP.NET. You can use all of your .NET classes that you're familiar with. We're not getting that far away from ASP.NET, so you can still use code that you're comfortable with. And then the main things that it's enabling you to do, so how we're going past ASP.NET, is that it's giving you more control over your HTML. So all these things that we talked about that were negative before, view state, control IDs that weren't very good, SEO problems, all of that is what it's giving you control to handle in MVC. You have complete control over how your page renders. By default, you're going to use the ASPX or the ASP.NET Web Forms render engine, we'll call it that. So you're going to use that same familiar syntax, that same page extension, but you can use any rendering engine you wanted with ASP.MVC. There's no requirement there, but the point is you have a lot more control over the HTML that's coming out of your web application. You have a lot more control over the URLs, and you have a system that enables you to do much better testing of a website. So it's from the ground up built with test-driven development in mind, or with the ability to unit test the website, which is great for web developers because we've needed that in the ASP.NET space. So the MVC pattern is really sort of the core of what we're talking about with ASP.NET MVC. And how does that work? What does it look like? At a very broad level, we've got the request coming in, and as I've said before, every website starts the request. That's not changing. It's fundamental to how browsers and servers work. Somebody comes in with a request to your site, and it hits the server. Now in this case, traditionally with a ASP.NET page today, where would the request go first? Anybody know? Okay, IIS is sort of the controlling mechanism, which is true, and it's still a controlling mechanism here, but where would the request go? What would handle where would the logic exist that would handle the request? Okay, your handlers, which is technically correct. ASP.NET Engine. So you're sort of walking down the right path, and worker process, all these. So I know we have a lot of web developers in the room because I'm hearing lots of correct ASP.NET terms. Really, what I'm talking about is when a request comes in for an ASP.NET page today, it goes to the page. The page ultimately handles that request, right? So all the logic for how that page is going to be handled and requested and processed, it all exists within the page. So request comes in, the page determines what I should do with the request. Should I send back HTML? Should I redirect it to a new location? Should I output an image? Whatever it happens, the page contains that handling logic. So in an MVC world, when that request comes in through IIS, which is running on the worker process, all these terms that were correct, then instead of going to a page, it goes directly to a controller. So this is something that you've got to sort of wrap your mind around, is that no longer do requests come in and go straight to a page. They go to an actual class. They go to a controller. And the URLs no longer map to pages. URLs map to controllers. So request comes in, it goes to the controller. Now the controller is in complete control, thus the name, of what should be returned to the user or to the browser. So in this case, the controller can say, maybe we want to display some user records. The controller will go to the model, or in other words, and it's just another word for your database structure, your data access layer, however you've got that constructed. It'll get data from your model, and then it'll decide, okay, what view should I use to display this data to the user? It'll pick that view, send the request, pass along the data that needs to be displayed in the view, and the view is only responsible for formatting that data and putting it back in the web browser. So the view's sole task in life now is to render HTML and to collect input from the user and pass it back to the controller, which really isn't technically how that works anymore. But nonetheless, you can get the picture here that the controller now is in the middle, and the view and the model sort of operate are orchestrated by the controller, and the response goes back to the user. So let's look at this in a little bit more concrete terms, in terms of how it relates to ASP.NET MVC. Let's say I've got a site here in my browser. We'll call it mysite.com, and I go to mysite.com/stores. So that request is going to leave my browser. It's going to hit the server. The first thing it's going to come to is the stores controller. So by default, ASP.NET MVC maps the URL to the URL name plus controller. And this is sort of default in the engine and the way the routing works. You have complete control over the routing, which we'll look at in more detail as we go here. But nonetheless, I go to mysite.com/stores. I hit the stores controller. I don't hit an ASPX page. I don't hit a page at all. I'm hitting a class. I'm hitting controllers class. My stores controller is going to say, okay, I need to do something with the model. Maybe I need some data to display. So I'm going to go to my store model, which maybe I built with link to SQL, maybe I built with link to entities, or I built with any ORM system that I may use to access my data. It could just be simple data readers as well. I'm going to go to my model. My model is going to handle all the processing necessary to go to my database, which could be SQL Server, Oracle, whatever. All that processing logic that handles anything that touches my database is now stored in my model. Give data back to my controller, and then my controller is going to say, okay, I've got this view data now. The model is giving me back this data that needs to be displayed in the page, so I'm going to send that view data onto a view, and I'm going to pick the view that needs to be sent back in the response to the browsers. In this case, we've got two URLs, /stores and /store/edit/5. And so in this case, we're saying it could go to either display with the first one or edit in the second case, but the same controller will end up pushing both views to the browser. So a controller doesn't have to push one view. A controller is in the position to say, I can decide which view should be best, and one controller can push many views to the browser depending on what the situation calls for. In this case, we've got a simple illustration of two. We also have the ASPX extension on these pages. Now, these aren't standard ASP.NET pages in the way you might think of them. They are in the sense that they're just ASPX pages. You can't change that. But they don't have any sort of code behind where any logic is being processed. They have code behind files. But the only thing you might find there is very simple data binding, where the data has been passed with from the controller to the page, and then all the page is responsible for is binding it to some UI element. You're not doing any data access like we do today in ASP.NET within our actual pages. So how does the workflow or what is the life cycle of an ASP.NET MVC page? The kind of concept of the ASP.NET page life cycle goes away when we get into MVC, just sort of by default, and we're left with a new sort of life cycle we can describe. Request comes in. It goes to our HTTP routing engine, which decides how to route the request. And then we look up at our route and our route tables based on the URL, what controller should this go to. A route handler will handle that. Then we pass through the normal ASP.NET HTTP handlers. We finally hit the controller, which is the class, which is going to decide what to do with that request. The controller will then go to the view engine, whatever it is. By default, it's the ASP.NET view engine, the ASPX pages. The view engine will then process the view and send the response. So you've got a new sort of flow that goes through the controller, also through our standard ASP.NET techniques, so you can still use your HTTP handlers. None of that goes away. You still have the option to use that. We have these sort of new routes to get through and out to the browser. One thing you don't see here, that you don't see me talking about, is page load, view state load, all these sorts of things, pre-init that we kind of deal with today with web forms. That much is gone. The days of dealing with the full ASP.NET page lifecycle, those concepts don't exist in ASP.NET MVC by default, because instead the controller is handling all that, and the page doesn't need to worry about view state. The page doesn't need to worry about pre-init because it's not being handled anymore. All the page is doing is displaying data. So in short, what does ASP.NET MVC enable you to do? It enables you to map URLs to classes, which is important. It enables classes to handle the processing of actions, no longer pages, and it decides which view to render to the page. Everything is interface-based, which is how we end up with our testability. So all the classes built into the ASP.NET MVC framework at the core level, the framework level, are based on interfaces so they can be mocked out within your testing, which is something that's not done in ASP.NET today. Everything is extensible and everything is testable, which means you can extend the MVC framework in any way you need to make it fit what you're doing. You're not locked into the standards, the defaults that come out of the box. You're not locked into the ASP.NET View Engine. You're not locked into any sort of data model that it provides. You can extend and modify MVC as much as you want to. The question is, do you want to? And I would think a large part of you probably don't because you're comfortable with the ASP.NET Web Forms model. So the defaults are pretty good. There are other patterns out there. MVC is not the only other alternative pattern. And one common alternative you may hear when you talk to people about MVC and moving outside of web forms is the MVP pattern. Is anybody aware of what the MVP pattern is? Well, you cheated. I put it up there. The model view presenter pattern, the MVP pattern, is very similar to MVC. In fact, it's based on the MVC pattern. It was developed after MVC was in the world, so it sort of takes the best from MVC, so to speak, and it blends it with a little bit of the model we're more familiar with. And the main difference being that the views now receive the calls directly. So you may remember when I was talking about MVC, I said the controllers receive the requests directly from the users. Now in MVP, the views receive the requests directly. So the views can actually have some more control within this model. That's the key difference, and we'll illustrate in a second. There are already some popular ASP.NET web forms-based solutions that use the MVP pattern. NMVP, MVC Sharp, don't get confused by the name there, it's using MVP. These frameworks, open source frameworks that are out there that implement the MVP pattern. So if you want to continue sticking with web forms and the current generation of ASP.NET technology, you can find these frameworks out there that enable you to sort of move into more structured coding, or move towards a more structured coding pattern like MVP. But to illustrate the differences, on one side here I've got MVP, on the other I've got MVC, and to me this is one of the clearest models or illustrations I've ever seen of the difference between the two patterns. So with MVC, which we've been talking about up to this point, I've got the user on one side. The user submits a request. It goes directly to my controller. My controller works back and forth with my model, my business objects, to collect data. And then it passes that data back, which we'll say presentation model in this case is view data. Basically, I'm taking my data back and handing it to my view, and then my view is going to the user. So that's MVC, and that's what ASP.NET MVC is using, that model. MVP, on the other hand, accepts the data directly into the view. So this is why it works really well with ASP.NET today, because you could think of the view as your ASPX page. When you use the MVP pattern with ASP.NET, that ASPX page is going to get a lot lighter. It's not going to do as much work as you make it do today. Nonetheless, it's well suited to the MVP pattern because in the MVP pattern, the request is still going directly to the page. So the request comes directly to the page or the view. The view then decides which controller it needs, and the controller then takes over, and all of your application logic is now moved out of the page where you may have it today and put into the controller, and then the controller, of course, deals with the model to get the data. So you can see this is very similar to what you may be doing with ASP.NET today, but it's a more structured barrier to keep that application logic outside of your views or your ASP.NET page's code behind file. That's not a good place for it. So MVP pattern helps you move more in that direction. Make sense? I hope so, because if it's not, we're moving on. So what are the key ingredients to make ASP.NET MVC work? Well, you need some routes. I mean, if we're going to have URLs that map to classes, somehow we've got to figure out how to define where these routes, or which classes these URLs should point to. And so to do that, we're going to use the global.asax file, which you should be familiar with if you've done web development with ASP or ASP.NET, because even in the old days of ASP, we had the global ASA file. So that comes back into play in a big way, because that's where we're going to define the routes for our application. We need to define controllers and views, which we're going to do in Visual Studio. We can use HTML helpers to help us write code and write HTML on our page without having to do a lot of it longhand. This helps us sort of figure out what we should write when we're dealing with this very abstract concept of controllers and views. We define a model. So for today's demos, we're going to use Link to SQL, but you can use any ORM tool you want to define your model and your business objects. Whatever you're used to, whatever you're comfortable with is fine. And there are a few key differences from web forms we need to make sure we're aware of as we start programming in ASP.NET MVC. First of all, there's no direct postbacks. So this is the key reason why the technologies you're using, or the controls you may be using today, let's say the server controls you're using today, you can't use those in MVC directly because MVC doesn't have a concept of posting back to the page it's on. Remember, requests go directly to a class. They go to a controller, and the controller can send back any number of different views. So no longer does the concept of posting back to yourself or sending postback data apply to MVC. So that concept changes as we move into the MVC world. There's no application code in the ASPX page, so there's still code behind file if you're using the ASP.NET engine to render your MVC pages, but you won't find application code there. At most, you should find very simple 1 or 2 lines of binding code as necessary, but really you should be finding very little code now at the ASPX level. And test-driven development, TDD. Is everybody familiar with test-driven development, or have you heard of test-driven development? Okay, maybe a third of you. For those that haven't, test-driven development is the concept essentially of building an application by writing tests first, making the test break, and then writing only the code that's necessary to fix the test. Sometimes it's called red-green testing, basically that concept of red-green within your test engines and your test cases. This is what MVC supports, and often if you read a lot of the blogs and the articles written about MVC, this is what MVC encourages. So let's look at some code. Let's get outside of PowerPoint and take a look at what MVC looks like. And we're going to start by going to Visual Studio and just creating a very simple MVC site. Let's see what the basic process is for getting started with MVC. So I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio. I'll zoom in at certain points so you guys can get a clearer view. Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to have the ASP.NET MVC bits installed. So go to Codeplex, first of all, install the ASP.NET MVC Preview 2. There may be a newer preview as we move past this week. Nonetheless, go out there, grab it, and when you do, it's going to add some templates to Visual Studio. So I'm going to come here and say add a new project. And Visual Studio is going to load up my project selection. And here in my project selection, you can see I've got ASP.NET MVC web application. And for those in the back, there's the proof that I have it. So I've got ASP.NET MVC web application. Notice I'm using .NET Framework 3.5. I'm also using Visual Studio 2008. So definitely both suggested when you're going to be working with MVC is to be using Visual Studio 2008 because of the multi-targeting support. If I go to 2.0 of the version 2.0 of the framework, notice that MVC disappears. And I'll zoom in again for your benefit. So if you're using Visual Studio 2008, make sure you've got the correct version of the .NET Framework selected, or you may not find the option where you expect it to be. If you're using 2005, you may not find the option at all. So definitely play with these tools. So we're going to select MVC. We'll just call it MVC Application 1. Why not? And we'll click OK. Now, right away, I get a dialog, which we don't usually get when we create websites. And what's it asking me to do? So would you like to generate a test project for this application? Well, right off the bat, then, we can see how much integration is built into MVC in terms of encouraging us to write unit tests for our web applications, to the point that it's prompting me right off the get-go, do I want a separate project to write unit tests for my web app? I say, sure, why not? Now, currently, we have a drop-down where we can select unit testing frameworks. The only one in there right now is the Visual Studio unit test, which comes in 2008 Pro. So in the future, they plan to support a lot of different testing frameworks, and they're making it easy for other frameworks to sort of be added to this list. So if you're using NUnit or MBUnit, whatever you're using to do your unit testing, that'll be available there as well. For now, we've just got Visual Studio Test. So I'm going to say, yeah, make me a project so I can run unit tests as well. We'll click OK. It'll cough out some files, and we can take a look at those. So now Visual Studio has created some default files for me, and let's take a look at what it's done. We've got 2 applications that have been created. One is my MVC application that we titled, and one is my tests. You can see that it's added a number of different default folders for me. We've got a content folder, controllers, models, and views, and then there's our global ASX file. And then within our MVC application test, we've got the controllers folder. If I expand a few of these, you can see that it's actually giving me a little bit of default content as well to work with. In the controllers, I have a home controller. In views, I've got a few different views, including a shared view with a master page. That should look familiar if you've worked with ASP.NET. The .master files. You can still use master pages, just as you're familiar with doing in classic ASP.NET with MVC. Clearly, the way you're going to write your code is a little different, but you can still use that concept, and you're going to put those kind of files in this shared directory, and we'll talk more about why as we go here. But nonetheless, it's generated a lot of sort of default starting points for me. And if I just hit F5 right now, I'll make this my startup application. And we'll just hit F5 and see what we get. You'll see that right out of the box when you create a new MVC site, at least today with Preview 2, it's going to create a website that I can look at in the browser, sort of get a sense for how it works. Let's see what we get. It's going to load up today in Firefox. Of course, you could use IE, whatever browser you prefer, especially when you're working with MVC. Remember that we're working with very lightweight HTML, very clean HTML, so it should work increasingly in almost any browser you throw at it. And here's the site. So when you create a new MVC site with Preview Bits 2, without doing anything, as soon as you run the site, you're going to get this sort of test project to sort of start working with and getting comfortable with how it works. On the left, it's got a number of links to send you to places to learn more about MVC. And then we've got 2 pages. Now, the concept of pages has changed, and we'll look at how this works. Basically, we've got home. If I click on this directly, you can see, look at the URL, and I'll zoom in for you. Look at the URL. The URL is just /home. There's no /home.aspx. So all you're saying, okay, this is great for search engine optimization. There's no extra information in my URL that doesn't need to be there. If I click on About, we can see that my URL will change as well. Now I've got /home/about, and I've got some different data here to look at. So right out of the box, I've got some data to work with, something to start understanding how MVC works. So now that we have our site built, we need to sort of build on this concept so we can actually have a more meaningful website that's built with MVC. To do that, we have to define our core elements. Obviously, we've got what does MVC stand for? Okay, good. You've been awake. You at least know that much. Model view controller. So to do that, we have to define those 3 elements. First is model. So to define the model, we can use anything we want. I've stressed that here enough. It's responsible for maintaining state. So since view state's gone, you no longer have that crutch to lean on. You have to start maintaining state yourself. And this is one of the big things that you have to remember as you leave the ASP.NET Web Forms world, is that some things are going to be harder to do in MVC. It's just sort of the nature of moving towards a more pure, standards-based, no extra junk in the page-based approach to web development. You're going to have to take on those tasks yourself. And in the concept of MVC, the model should be responsible for handling all of your state management. That doesn't mean you have to maintain all of your state in a database. It just means you should maintain your state somewhere that can be persisted back to the page. You can use any data access frameworks. Simple data readers will be fine. If you want to write your data access layer using data readers yourself, be my guest. It's a torturous approach. It's going to waste a lot of your time, but you can do it that way. A much better approach is to use a framework out there like nhibernate, LLBgen, Link to SQL, any of these ORM tools that exist that make it much easier for you to write your ORMs. That's a great approach to take. In fact, the Subsonic project, anybody in here familiar with the Subsonic project? Subsonic is an open source project that also provides you with a way of defining an ORM with a number of other things. I would be insulting the creators of the project if I said it was just ORM, but nonetheless, the base key guy behind that project now works for Microsoft, and he works on the MVC project as well. So you can expect a lot of tie-in between the Subsonic project and the ASP.NET MVC framework, to the point where you may eventually see something very similar to Ruby on Rails that comes out of the MVC team based on Subsonic with MVC support. So definitely, as you learn more about MVC, spend some time learning a little bit more about Subsonic, because it'll probably do you some benefit down the road. Once our model is stored, once our model is created, we're going to have it probably stored in the models folder. That's the prescribed guidance that we get out of the box with MVC. Keep our model classes, the classes related to defining and accessing our data, in the model folder. You don't have to, but that's sort of, again, good guidance. And the key is that you can do it however you want, and that it handles manipulating the data. So no longer, or maybe I should make sure I understand how you guys develop. How many people right now, and let's be honest here, we're all friends, have an ASP.NET website that does some kind of data access in the code behind files? You are all liars. If you've written an ASP.NET site, you've probably fell into the trap that's very easy to do, where you've accessed some data source from the code in your code behind files. You didn't leave it up to your data access layer to do the code or do the data manipulation data access. with MVC, that's really the core thing to remember when you're defining the models, that all data access code, manipulation, updating, whatever, happens in the model. The controllers, we've already established quite plainly, they receive the request, they decide what happens. The URLs map directly to these controllers, so we're going to use our routes that we define in the global ASX file to map to the controllers that we're going to make in the controllers directory, which should be obvious. You define the controller's actions. So when we looked at our demo site that loads up by default with the MVC framework, we saw URL/home, URL/about, and these /home/about map to actions within action methods, if you will, within our controllers. So now every URL that we have maps to a controller and to a method. So we call our methods basically by defining different URLs. It's a new way of sort of thinking about the way your methods get called. But because you're mapping directly to classes or to controllers, not to pages, this is how the controllers know what to execute for different URLs, different pages. And we'll look at how that works. But for instance, with the URL/products/list, that would equal the list method in the products controller class. That's how that URL would come out in the browser. We'll get into more details so it will become clear as we go. And finally, you have to construct some views. And I'm checking my time. It looks like we've got about 15 minutes left, so we'll make sure we pace ourselves correctly so you can see some good demo. So when we build the views, we usually want to output HTML. I mean, you could output an image file or something else. You could stream some other bits back, but usually we're going to be streaming back HTML in most cases. We can use ASPX pages, we can use ASCX user controls, we can use master pages, all these things that are familiar to us as ASP.NET developers, we can carry forward into the MVC world. They're just going to behave a little bit differently because of how we're going to write our code. Nonetheless, we can continue to use these things as our view engine. There are other view engines out there, NVelocity, Braille. These are all engines that you can actually use with ASP.NET today, so just pick the view engine that you're most comfortable with. By default, it's going to be ASP.NET. It's going to receive data from the view data from the controller. You can then set your view to be strongly typed or not. If you strongly type your view, then you can actually get good IntelliSense support in Visual Studio as you write your view's HTML output. And then you render clean HTML. There's no more view state. There's no more control IDs that get messed around with by ASP.NET. Only the HTML you define is what ends up in the browser. And we'll take a look at HTML.actionLink, and then I'm going to define a few parameters, what the text of it should be, and then what action do I really want that to map to. So I'm not saying write a link to display.aspx. I'm saying using the routes that are defined in my global ASAX file, using my MVC routes, determine for me at runtime what the URL should be to map to this action on this product or on this controller, passing in this ID to get processed. And then when I do that, when the system runs, it'll automatically figure out, okay, I need to write a link tag that has something mapped to the stores controller with the action method display passing in the value of 5. So then the framework basically handles that task for me. So let's see how we do that in Visual Studio. So here's our project we just created again. We'll just keep working from there. The first thing we want to do, if we want to extend our project here, let's just add a new controller. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to right-click, if I can say it. We'll add a new item. In this case, it's just going to be a class file. There's nothing special about the items that we have to add. And we'll let Visual Studio 2008 catch up. So I have a number of different things in here. You can see there's an MVC controller class. There's nothing particularly special about this class template that it adds for you, except that it's encouraging you right away to use the prescribed naming, which is your controller name with controller afterwards. So in this case, let's say I want to create a controller that helps us deal with users or with support side of our help. So I could make this support controller, and I'll click Add. So now we've got a new controller in our controllers folder. Now we need this controller to do something eventually, so we need to add a new method. So let's maybe add a new method. We'll call it public void. Let's say we want an action method called users, so that when somebody goes to our site /support/users, they're going to get some data. So I'll say users, and we won't do anything yet within this space, and we'll save that. Now, when a controller decides, okay, I need to go to this location, it usually needs a view to display. So the next thing we need to do is add some views to our view folder. So if we come down here, Notice that by default, the structure of the views folder, and I'll zoom in for you, is to put views into subfolders, and the subfolders are actually named after the controllers. So you can see by default we had defined in our controllers folder the home controller. Then within our views folder we had a subfolder called home, and then within that we had two view pages, the about and the index. And if we looked at the home controller, we could see that it has two methods, index and about, and those two methods render view index and render view about. And then by default, the framework is going to go look into the views folder, it's going to look for a folder named home, and it's going to look for views with those names. So again, this can be changed if you want to, but by default, this is the structure that the project recommends. So that's the structure we're going to stick with for today. So I need something in my views folder, first of all, for my support controller. So I'm going to add a new folder. I'm just going to call it support to match the name of my new controller. Then I'm going to add a view, so I'm going to come back here, I'm going to add another new item. In this case, I'm going to pick an MVC view page. Because we're using a master page in this site, I can go ahead and use a view page, just like a content page within a traditional ASP.NET site. That's all I'm doing here. So we'll call this page, we can call it anything we want, but we'll just, for simplicity, call it users, so we can stay consistent with what we're doing. Click Add. We need to pick our master page. We can come back to our Views folder, and within the Shared folder, which is where we can put anything that's going to be shared across multiple views, we can come select our master file. Click OK. Now we've got our new content page. We can do something with HTML in here. And for now, let's just go ahead and do one of those fun, we've always seen it everywhere, no matter where you are in the world, hello worlds. And since we're in India, why not hello India? So we've got our new view, we've got our new controller. So in theory now, we should be able to reload our site and go to /support/users and pull up this page. But to do that first, we need to tell our users method to do something. Right now, if we did that, nothing would happen because our users method is empty. So to do that quite simply, we can just add a simple render view. This is basically the controller's way of saying, okay, what do you want me to send back to the users? And we'll say render view, and then we just need to supply a view name. In this case, our view name is users. And let's see what happens when we do that. So let's rerun our site. We've got a new controller defined. We've got a new page defined, or a view defined. So here's the application we were looking at before. Before I pull up what we're going to look at, let's look at the page source for this page that they provide by default. And we'll zoom in here. Notice what's missing quite quickly from the top of the page. There's no view state. There's no hidden fields. There's none of this junk that ASP.NET traditionally puts in our page. We see very clean, very simple HTML to define our page. List items, header tags. This is the kind of stuff that MVC enables you to do with ASP.NET. What we want to do is see if our new controller works. So we've added a new controller called support controller. So by default, the framework is mapping that to the support item in our URL. And then we need to map to an action method within our controller. And we define an action method called users. Happens. Hello, India. So there, we said, okay, when we go to support controller and we map to the users method, return a view, users. In the users view, we had one little tag in there that said, hello, India. So you can see it's pretty easy to do this, but we didn't have to go write some special URL rewriting to make that happen. All that's being provided in the framework, and it's automatically mapping to our controllers and to our views. Pretty simple, straightforward stuff. So let's move forward, and then we'll come back and see how this all pulls together with a model in just a moment. All this is being generated on the fly, so there's no model involved with the demo we've seen so far. This is just simple HTML. Right. As I always like to say, there's no magic up the sleeves in this case. Everything you see is what you're getting. I'm not doing anything special with controls to sort of render extra HTML. This is all provided right out of the framework. So, you saw me create this project from scratch right in Visual Studio. You saw me add an extra controller, add an extra view, and then just hit run without doing anything extra. And this is what we get in the page. Using master pages and all that kind of stuff provide the shell that we looked at it in. So this is the way you can do MVC projects in Visual Studio yourself without doing anything extra. Make sense? And I can answer some more questions as we get along here, but I want to make sure we cover the routing, because routing is a big part of MVC. Specifically, defining the routing table. And right now, the most common way to do that is by defining routes statically in the global ASAX file. You can define them in other places. You can define them with code. You can do the routes a number of different ways. It's sort of a common theme with ASP.NET MVC is you can do things however you want, but there are prescribed guidances that make it easier. You can completely customize the routing. By default here, we've been dealing with routing that says, okay, map the URL to a controller, and then map it to an action, and then if I have any extra data, make that last part of the URL the data that gets passed in. But you can completely change that if you want to. It's a very flexible URL routing system. It's actually been pulled out from MVC. It's been refactored out of MVC directly, and it's going to be made available to ASP.NET developers more broadly. So if you're looking for good URL rerouting in ASP.NET, you'll have the entire routing engine that's built for MVC available to you in, I think, the SP1 update of .NET 3.5, if I'm not mistaken. So you're going to get this power in the next version of .NET anyway. And it's all based on regular expressions. So it does regex matching. You can actually add validation to the routes as well. By default, we get a few routes defined for us in our global ASAX file. We get a route that I just talked about that's going to map the controller, the action, and the ID in the URL. It's going to look for those things, and that's how it's going to map it back into the system. And then we can also provide some defaults. So if I don't do anything, if I just go to my URL by default without adding anything up there, it's going to map to the index method by default. So it's going to sort of fill in the blanks for us there. And that's why when we created that new controller, you notice that it gave us by default the index method. That's so that this route would be supported. We also have, and this is examples of what it would do, store/display/5, that passes that route. We also have a route that's added by default for default.aspx. And you may have noticed in the files that were generated by MVC, we had a default.aspx file. Well, why do we have this? We're no longer dealing with ASPX files. Well, this is really to support IIS. So if we come to an MVC application, the first thing we hit and that ASP.NET's IIS is looking for is default.aspx, is our default page. Essentially, we add a route here to say, okay, map default.aspx to our home controller and fire the index method. Essentially, this is a sort of fix for IIS to make sure that it can handle MVC sites properly. Nothing too complex about why it's there, just to make sure that the sites work the way I expect them to. You can customize routes. So let's say we don't want a route that's just controller action ID. You could create a route that's search/query/page, and then replace the query part with whatever your search query was, and then if you had multiple pages, same for a blogging engine. There's a lot of neat things you can do with the routing to sort of make the route be very descriptive, which is very good for SEO, for search engine optimization, very good for your application usability, because as a lot of guys in the MVC project are saying now, everybody knows how to hack a URL. We've all been to websites where we can't get anywhere and we start chopping things off the URL to try to get somewhere. Even your mom can do this, as we often like to say. It passes the mom test. If that's the case, we need to make sure our URLs are as usable as possible because they're now an usability portion of our applications. And you can do validation. So in this bottom example here, if I wanted to limit something that somebody could add to my URL to only be letters, no numbers involved, I could write a regex expression that would say, okay, it has to pass this regex expression before it gets sent to my controller. If it doesn't pass this expression, don't send this request to my controller. Ignore it, which is very helpful in the way of doing validation within our applications. So let's take a look at the routes. And we've still got about a minute left, so we'll sort of look at this very quickly. So I'm going to open up my project again that we're looking at. And in this case, I'm going to open up one that's sort of been finished ahead of time and look at the routes defined in there. So here's my global ASAX file. We'll zoom in here. Not that far. So we've got 3 routes defined. We've got the 2 default routes that come, routes.add, and then we've got the controller action ID, default.aspx, and then we've added a new route, user search/name, with some validation for only being letters. So you can see that we've got quite a bit of flexibility in here to do what we want to do with routing to make it fit our application. And you could come in here and just add as many routes as you want to define your routing table. The really neat thing that you can also do is, and I recommend it in the slides, is you can download from Phil Hack's blog the route debugger. And I've added 1 line of code to my application start that makes that work. He has an assembly you can download from his website. And when you have that line of code in there, it basically overrides what the application would normally do so that when I run this, And if you'll bear with me for just a minute, I will show you this and then wrap up. We'll run this in the browser. And now, instead of actually going to the controller that it's supposed to go to, right now I expect my application to load up into a page, and instead loads this, which is my route tester. And essentially what this shows me is here are all the routes I've defined within my global ASX file, and here's what passes. What URL, this URL in the browser, which of these rules does it pass? Right now it's passing the catch-all and the default ASPX. If I want to test to see if my user search route works, I could come up here, change the route to user search, let's say /Todd. And now we see, okay, this URL passes this rule. So this is a way of testing your routes as you add them to make sure that you get the results you expect. And just to show you how the validation works, notice that for this route, we'll go forward here, this route says that I can only have letters, basically what my regex is saying there. So if I put in user search /23 and hit enter, notice that that route doesn't pass now. Now it's false because it's failed my validation. So you have a lot of control within your application for how these routes work. This is a great way to test them and to sort of visualize how they're working. So let's wrap up. I think we've gone over time. We've got some slides in here that I'm going to make available to you so you can sort of dig through them. I try to make my slide decks full so you can take them and browse through them in your own time and understand these concepts. So take a look at the testing application stuff. We're not going to have time to go through how you actually do the testing today, but I have some great resources included in my sample code that shows you what you need to do to start mocking out objects, and that's one of the key difficulties in doing testing is object mocking. So I provide some good resources in my demo code and in the slides that you can look at when you download in your own time. Some good comparisons of ASP.NET and MVC. The sort of summary statement here is how do you choose? If you're a web developer now using ASP.NET, how do you choose whether to stick with ASP.NET or to choose MVC? And this is a good sort of comparison that you can just kind of look at and say, which of these fits what I need to do? If you're happy with ASP.NET, first of all, good. If you like having a mature third-party market, which means lots of tools, lots of open source projects, and you want to be able to develop as quickly as possible, don't leave ASP.NET. Stick with it. It's going to be fine for you. If you want better separation of concerns, if you want the ability to control your HTML completely, not have ASP.NET do things you don't want it to do, and you want deep testability, start looking at ASP.NET MVC. It may be the more suitable choice for your future web development. You just have to pick what's best for what project that you're working on. Future of MVC, clearly, it's got a long ways to go. We're in preview 2. It's been out for less than a year. The MVC team has said repeatedly it'll be done when it's done, so we don't know exactly when that is, but it'll continue to be updated and we can continue to look at sort of how it evolves. It's already at a great point, though, to go download and start getting involved in it yourself, evaluating it and deciding if it's something that'll work in your organization. I will be around here afterwards. I know we've hit our time. If you have questions, feel free to come up and ask. I'll be happy to help. The slides and these code that we've had today will be on my blog at teleworkwatch.com. Feel free to download it. Shoot me an email if you have questions when you're looking at it. I'll be happy to help you guys on your road to MVC. Thank you guys so much for coming today. Enjoy the rest of the conference.